As I was just so wonderfully introduced, my name is Kathryn Grayson Nanz. I'm a senior front-end engineer at Threat Connect. And just as a super quick note before we really get into it, you can find a copy of this slide deck and a transcript of this talk, both available linked in my profile if those are helpful to you. So as someone with a design background who has transitioned into front-end development, component libraries have always felt like the perfect blend of all my favorite things. It's really essential for our applications to be well designed, and not only because that makes them nice to look at, but because our users deserve applications that are accessible and intuitive. But that's always been one of those like easier said than done kind of things, unless you have a component library. So I can kind of imagine right now you're like, boy, she's really hyped about this, and you are correct. At this point, I've had the chance to build two different totally custom component libraries, one in React and one in Angular, for two very different companies. And I've gotten the chance to see firsthand the impact that those have had on both of those teams. And that's made me really passionate about this approach to UI design and development. In both situations, I've been the lead on those projects to create, implement, and maintain the libraries. And while the teams and the applications could not have been more different, the impact that the library had on their workflow and their productivity was actually incredibly similar. In both companies, I came into a situation where I was building the library from the ground up. The first company had a pretty established print guideline set. They had kind of your logos, your brand colors, your fonts, all of that stuff, but nothing that really equipped them to offer the kind of design guidance the developers needed to build an application. So the developers had started making UI decisions on their own on a case-by-case basis. And spoiler alert, none of those cases ever seemed to end with the same decision. So their application struggled hugely with UI inconsistency and confusion in users. And that was the main problem that we were solving for with the library there. The second company, my current company, was much larger and has a much more complex application. This has meant that there are more resources for creation and for maintenance, including a dedicated designer to work with, which has been amazing. But along with that came a much larger lift for the adoption and initial implementation. In this case, we were creating the library in order to speed up developer build time on new features and to make it easy to apply design updates across the entirety of the application. That was an especially important aspect as they were in the process of creating a new design system and were really concerned about rollout, making that as easy and as thorough as possible. Common to both companies, though, was one last fairly common internal pain point: engineers who absolutely hated to write CSS. UI styling was not work that many of my team members enjoyed doing or sometimes even felt really comfortable doing. And while I do genuinely enjoy that kind of work as that like hybrid design engineer role, I recognize that I'm often in the minority there. So in both situations, what we really needed was a way for all the team members to feel enabled to work confidently with the UI. The creation of a component library was really a perfect solution to all of those problems, in addition to solving some other problems along the way, like making it easier to focus on accessibility or offering a place for quick prototyping and user testing. It's a hugely beneficial effort that has made both companies' applications more cohesive and more user-friendly, and has reduced a ton of developer pain points. So if you've been listening to all that and thinking, boy, we really could use one of those where I work, then good news, you're in the right session. Today, we're going to take a high-level walk through all the steps of creating a component library, from tooling decisions and choosing which components to build, to getting buy-in from your team and maintaining the library that you've created. Because as it turns out, actually coding the components is kind of the easiest part of making a component library. The first step to setting up your library is picking your tools and actually creating the space where you'll write the components, with one very big asterisk. I don't want you to get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty of all of this right when you start. Your goal at this point is just MVP. You want to get just enough in place to really write some basic components and start to prove the value of your library. I don't want to spend our limited time together today walking through setup minutia. Every tool I'm going to mention has really fantastic documentation, and I'm totally happy to answer questions afterwards. But what I want to do right now is a super quick setup, a walkthrough of some of the setups that I've used, so you have a jumping off point without having to do all of that research and comparison. So as I mentioned briefly before, one company wanted their library built in React, and the other preferred to use Angular. Both worked perfectly well. So when it comes to this, I think it's completely a matter of personal preference and alignment with whatever tech stack you already have in place. To manage the library, we use Storybook, which is a fantastic tool that I really, really highly recommend. It's super easy to use, it has a very small learning curve, and it comes built in with nearly everything that you'll need to start your library. Those two things, a framework and Storybook, are really all you need to get started. Within Storybook, you can install some things called add-ons or decorators, and those are kind of like extensions that will add features to the Storybook UI. This is very cool, super useful. There are tons of open source add-ons and decorators out there that can help you with everything from mobile responsiveness to creating routing-aware components. And that is absolutely something you'll want to take advantage of to enhance your library down the road. But when you first start, I'm going to strongly recommend you just go with plain vanilla Storybook and don't stress the add-ons until you get a feel for what your library actually needs based on how it's being used. It can be really easy to go down the rabbit hole here. And the more you add, the more difficult it makes it for other people to jump in and understand what's happening. With the different setups at the different companies, it's also natural that we ended up integrating all kinds of different libraries to help support component building. I've used GreenSock and Animate CSS, Font Awesome, and pretty much every version of CSS, vanilla CSS Less, Sass, it all works well. I also like Prettier a lot as a code formatter. All this to say, though, that it's really easy to integrate any of the dependencies that you're using in your primary application. And in fact, it's a really good thing to do that so that you can build those components in an environment with all the same stuff that's available to you in your primary application. You really want to encourage people to start building in the library as much as possible. And this is just one more way you can make that path a little bit smoother. Perhaps most importantly, though, you'll need a way to get the components from the library into your applications. Both companies that I've worked with have chosen to set up the library as a private NPM package. This, however, is going to be something that's a little different everywhere, depending on your goals and how you want to use the library. Consider whether you'll be sharing your library with outside parties if you use contractors or freelancers a lot, whether you need to make this open source or not, and what's going to kind of work with your existing workflow and setup most naturally. With every step, your goal should always be to make using the library as easy as humanly possible. The more hurdles you put in the path, the harder it will be to get that buy-in. Even if it doesn't necessarily feel like the right way or like the industry standard way, I'm always going to suggest that you do what works best for your team. Okay, so once you're set up and you're ready to build some components, now you have to decide what to build. It can be incredibly tempting to use this as an opportunity to just throw out everything and do this complete UI design overhaul, or even just mimic the component list from another company's more established library. But realistically, you're going to be far better off leveraging what you already have. The easiest way to do this is to start moving over components from a shared library in your application if you have one, and I found that a lot of places do. The main thing to make sure you're aware of when you take this approach is separating your business logic from the component that you put into the library. You might already be familiar with smart and presentational components, but just in case you're not, here's a really quick definition. Your smart components are the ones that are going to include your kind of case-specific business logic, things that execute functions and save information and manage your state, all of that. Presentational components, which if you Google, you might also see called dumb components, but we don't do that. Presentational components will only receive the information and display it, purely UI. And that's what you want in your component library. That's going to make your components most flexible and adaptable. Once you start tangling up all the logic in the component, you create more and more edge case situations where you need something to look the same but behave differently. You want to nip that in the bud really early and make sure that you're only putting those presentational components in your library and handling the smart stuff in your application. If inconsistency is one of the problems that you're trying to solve with your library, I highly suggest taking the time to do a full interface inventory, as Brad Frost calls it. This means going through your application screen by screen and cataloging all the varieties of your existing UI elements. So, for example, what do your buttons look like on each page? What about your form inputs, the checkboxes? Take a screenshot of each visually different element and start collecting them in a document, like in the example here. Once you have that, you can look at those pieces of your UI that show up most often, and those will be your starter components. You're going to want to try to cap this list at like 8 to 10 components max. And you want to keep that so low because one of the most common pitfalls of component library creation is the team that puts a ton of upfront time and effort into creating this elaborate component library that just doesn't actually get used. This can happen for a variety of reasons, but one of the most common is finding out that no one actually has a use for the components you made. You guessed at what needed to be made and you guessed wrong. You want people to be able to immediately implement your library and see the benefits. So for now, focusing on those small, often recurring basic UI elements will ensure you have something that's definitely usable right away. And you can get that quick win and build momentum, excitement, and buy-in for your library. If your application has a fairly consistent design already, then creating your component is just a case of copying the existing code for that element into Storybook and tweaking it to accommodate any props or inputs it'll need to accept. But more likely, you will find that you have like 3 or 5 or 20 different buttons that you found during your interface inventory. And now you need to choose which ones are going to actually be your buttons moving forward. When you're making this decision, make sure you're keeping in mind all the different contexts in which these buttons are currently being used. You may find that you need a few different button components to meet all of those needs, and that's fine too. Both libraries that I've worked on have had a set of 4 to 5 kind of standard buttons, all for different uses. Start creating your components, but also work on nailing down the different situations in which each one is intended to be used. Another thing to keep in mind while you work is how your components will change based on state. For example, does your button need a disabled state? Probably needs a hover state and a focus state, maybe an error state. It's really important to consider all the varied ways in which your users could be interacting with your component, and make sure you've thought about how your component needs to respond in each situation. This kind of attention to detail is what helps people actually use the library, because if the components aren't equipped to handle the kind of real-world situations your users will regularly encounter, developers simply won't bother to use them. As part of the component creation process, make sure that you're not just writing code, but also writing documentation, so other developers can understand how to use these components correctly. Other folks will not be able to guess your intentions for where they should use a primary button as opposed to a secondary button, so that's on you to define and document that information. Remember, the goal here is always, always, always ease of use. You want someone to be able to come into your component library having never seen it before, pick it up, just like that. This checklist by Emma Wedekind is a really wonderful resource for making sure you've considered all those aspects of your component during the creation process, all the way from design, things like customization and accessibility, to documentation, providing code snippets and input requirements. After step 2, you should have a basic component library with a handful of components that are ready for prime time. That means it's time to actually start using the library in your applications, so your team and your users can start reaping the benefits. You may also notice at this point that some of those components you created in the bubble of the component library aren't quite meeting the needs of where you want to use them for real. You'll likely need to make some adjustments, and that is a normal and inevitable part of the process. I really want to encourage you to not look at it as a failure, even though it kind of can feel that way in the moment, because it's very much not. In fact, it's actually an important part of that never-ending honing and maintenance process that you're going to continue for the entire life of your library. Each one of those situations allows you to make your component more adaptable and more usable. So just embrace them as opportunities for improvement. Hopefully, though, those bumps in the road are relatively minor and outweighed by the immense joy of KonMariing a bunch of your old code and letting those new components spark joy. This is also the point where it's important for you to really start talking this up a little bit, getting folks on board, getting them excited about the library. You want to show them how useful it is, how easy it's going to make their life, even with just your handful of starter components. You need everyone to, at the very least, be on board with using the library. And if they're not, that's your chance to ask them for specific feedback. Ask them which parts of the library they do find useful and which parts they don't. What would make them excited to use it? Are there blockers that are keeping them from using it now? Did they hit any snags when they tried to, either technical or design? Shop it around, ask questions, and keep iterating until you find what works for your team. Once you've got the basics and the library is actually in use, it's time to start thinking about expansion. We keep a backlog of components that we want to build someday, but don't really have an urgent need for right now. This could be components you want to redesign or improve, components you anticipate needing for a feature that's coming down the road, or components you've gotten specific requests for. I highly recommend actually capturing these in a Jira ticket and adding them to your backlog, not only so that you don't forget a good idea, but also to make it easier for the other folks on your team to get involved and pick up tasks when they have spare time they can invest in the library. In terms of component library related recommended reading, I simply cannot suggest Brad Frost's Atomic Design enough. This is the approach I like to take to component building, combining a library of base components into larger organisms. For example, you can kind of see here how we've leveraged our SVG icon atom in our alert bar organism. And again, you can see the badge component being used in the tabs component here. Not only does this make your life easier, but it should also be a reassurance that the components you've created are the right ones. If you find yourself using them over and over again before you even leave the library, then they were clearly components that were needed. On the flip side, you'll probably also discover some of the components that you thought you needed aren't really being used. It's great to go through and take stock every now and again, so you can reduce that clutter in the library. When you do this, make sure you're checking in with other developers and designers to see why that component just wasn't being used. Maybe it was a little too limited or opinionated, or there was something just kind of inconvenient about how it was built. But the component itself still has potential. Asking prevents you from throwing the baby out with the bathwater or repeating that mistake in other components. As you're revising your library, make sure that you're also tagging your components to denote their status. This doesn't have to be anything really fancy, like adding work in progress or retired to a component name, or you could split them off into a separate section. Storybook is really great about supporting lots of kind of nesting and organization. That's the method that I prefer. But whatever you choose, it just needs to allow other users of the library to see at a glance what's coming, what's being removed, and what's fair game for them to use in the features they're building right now. It's much better to offer this kind of labeling upfront than for a component to suddenly disappear and break something. Again, if your library is creating extra work for people to use, they just will not bother to use it. I've said that a lot, but it's really crucially important. Like if you take any one thing away, let it be that. Easy as possible. In the same way that you can opportunistically refactor, I also recommend that you opportunistically maintain your component library. Frankly, it's not always realistic to fit dedicated component library time into every single sprint, and even more frankly, you don't really need to once you get things up and running smoothly. We look at our upcoming stories, see where we can tie component creation or refactoring into work that has to be done anyway to support feature development, and then just estimate that work all together as part of the same story. For that reason, it's helpful to keep that component library backlog, those tickets, pulled up during your sprint planning, if those aren't already in your general backlog. As you talk through upcoming work, see if any of the components would be useful or add new ideas to the list for later. Both companies that I've worked with have made contributions or edits to their libraries every single sprint since creation, without having allocated specific time necessarily to do that, and I credit this opportunistic maintenance approach primarily. If you don't improve or expand your component library, it will eventually become outdated and stop being useful. Opportunistically building these small, regular amounts of library maintenance into your existing workflow will do wonders to prevent this. My component library journey has not been without a few missteps, though. So in addition to some of the things that I've already mentioned, here are just a few more that I want to call out, especially as being things that I really wish I knew when I was first starting. Keep it simple. This is by far the piece of advice that I most wish that I had. When creating components, you want to keep them basic and flexible and open to various uses. When I wrote my first components, I intentionally kept them quite limited. I knew my other developers were not interested in making design decisions, so I tried to be as opinionated as possible for them. As a quick example, I was really afraid people would put a bunch of content into pop-up modals, something that I feel should be used as sparingly as possible and with minimal text. I kept imagining these worst case scenarios with these like giant modal components on the page. So when I built the modal component, I only allowed you to pass in text and a header. But then of course the application needed a modal with a button and then one with two buttons like a confirm deny, and eventually one with a text box. And as I went back and rewrote that component for the third time, it occurred to me I should have just let people pass in whatever children they wanted from the get-go. In the end, I found myself frustrated by my own aggressive restrictions. You can't tell the future, and you will waste your time trying to guess all the ways in which engineers could use or misuse a component. It's way better to start with a less opinionated component and then use your documentation to specify how it should be used. If you really have a problem, you can always go back later and build in restrictions if they're really needed. But flexible components should always be the ideal. It makes your components more usable, and that's the goal at the end of the day. Work in progress components are okay, even good. At first, the component library was like my pet project, my baby, and I really didn't want anyone to see it in any form other than sheer perfection. But this was a mistake. It prevented people from seeing what was in the works, from making suggestions or thinking ahead about how they could incorporate upcoming components. And even worse than that, it made people feel really uncomfortable creating or editing components on their own. Felt like they were stepping on my toes or getting in the way. But it really needs to be a team effort if everyone's really going to use it and be on board. Don't think of your component library as an art museum so much as it's like an art studio. It's okay if it's a little untidy as long as it's generally organized chaos. Plus, as an unintentional side effect to keeping those works in progress in the library, I found that it's kind of the perfect place to prototype new things in isolation and do some real quick and dirty user testing. Rather than constructing any kind of elaborate Figma mockups, you can rough something out really, really quickly in the library, especially once you can leverage a set of components you already have. And then you can put that in front of users as like hallway testing for them to interact with. And that can give you some really excellent, super focused feedback, what they gravitate to, what's confusing, all of that like on the micro level. It allows for really fast, iterative, and feedback-based development. And then when you're ready to build it for real, the bulk of the front end work is already done. You just kind of have to move it out of the library into the application and connect all the wires. Build in accessibility as you go. Often the task of making an app accessible can feel kind of daunting and overwhelming if that wasn't a consideration from day one. It's definitely something I've grappled with in every application with legacy code. So, in every application. I wish it had been pointed out to me earlier how much a component library can help with that. The process of building for accessibility becomes a lot easier when you can break it into those bite-sized pieces and really tackle it one component at a time. Every time you use that component in the future, you can do so assured that it's already optimized and ready for all of your users. And that just kind of redoubles as you start to use components and other components, et cetera, et cetera. Every time you use those accessibly built components, you get the accessibility for free. And it just makes it really nice. It makes it really easy. So to wrap this all up, after multiple years of using component libraries every single sprint at two very different companies, I feel confident that it is well worth the upfront investment of time and resources. I can say without hesitation that it makes my own job easier, and I've watched really proudly as it's become a resource for my coworkers, not just on my own team, but actually on other teams across the companies as well. And if building a component library appeals to you or interests you, I really want to encourage you to look into it. If you have any questions about what I've done or how you could replicate this at your company, please feel free. You can ask. I think we've got a quick Q&A coming up here, or you can write me an email or DM me on Twitter, like whatever. I would love to talk about it with you. So thank you guys all so much for listening, and happy component creating.
And yes, we do have time left for Q&A, so if you have questions for Kathryn, you can post them in the chat. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session and for attending day one of Connect Reimagine. We will be back tomorrow for more talks. But now I'll give the floor back to you for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat.
Okay, cool. Here's one. How is Storybook for documentation? Does it automatically generate docs at all, or is it a manual process? So Storybook will technically auto-generate some docs for you, but I don't think that they're incredibly helpful. They will document kind of the bare bones of how your component works. So like what props it accepts and some of that stuff. But I think the documentation is almost more useful in terms of being able to specify what should be used where and under what circumstances. And Storybook obviously cannot do that for you. So a little of column A, a little of column B. The Storybook auto-generated docs are definitely better than nothing, but they can't provide design guidance, and I think that's half the battle. What is your favorite framework? I like React. React is my personal preference. Angular's fine. And why? You know, I don't have a good answer to why. It's the first one I learned. It's got a special place in my heart. I pivoted from React to Angular, and it's again fine, but not my fave. Is making a component library for small projects as practice a good idea or overboard? I tend to think that anything you're doing for practice is never really overboard. If you're learning something from it, it's worth it. In like actual, if you were doing it kind of for real, not as practice, to like achieve the goals of a component library, I think you do start to see diminishing returns based on size of the project. But I'm not sure it's ever like a really bad idea. Let's see. What can a developer do to make the designer's job easier in your experience? It's going to sound really, it's going to sound really predictable to say communicate, but communication I think is really the biggest one, especially if you kind of know leading in that there's going to be technical limitations or restrictions, or any places where your hands are kind of tied based on legacy code or timelines or any of that. The more of that information that you can give to a designer ahead of time, that tends to be the stuff that they don't hear. So more of that you can communicate, the better. I know I'm just like banging through these questions. So feel free to tell me to stop or slow down or ask follow-up stuff if there's anything I missed. How do you make and share your documentation with your team to ensure everyone has easy access to it and knows where it is? The documentation for when to use the components. So that we do have built into Storybook. So in each Storybook component, there is a section where it previews the component for you, and then there's another tab for documentation. And we just build that right in. So if you're looking at the component in Storybook, the docs are right there ready for you. We have some documentation about Storybook itself and about the library that lives in Confluence. So yeah, no worries. I don't know that I said that, so you missed nothing. What are the common mistakes you see people make on documentation? I think excluding the designers. I think developers are really good about, everything can be really good. When developers write documentation, they're good about writing it for other developers. But again, half the battle of a component library is making sure that you've captured when each component is supposed to be used, And so if you're trying to differentiate and say, in this situation, we want all of our buttons to look this way, but in this situation, green buttons are always for confirmation and your red buttons are always for cancellation. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't tend to make it into documentation. And if it's not written down anywhere, then it's just in some designer's brain of what their intent was when they first made the component. So I would say that's probably the biggest one. What are tips to find a good mentor within the company or outside of the company? Gosh. I would say find the people who are doing the job you want to do and ask them questions. I found most people are generally pretty receptive, respect their time. Definitely don't just barrage them. But I found that most people, when I come to them with a genuine question or a concern, are happy to sit down and talk about it. And I found that to be true both with people that I've worked with in the same company and with people that I've met at conferences or on Twitter or whatever. People like to talk about the things they're passionate about. So I would find the point where you connect and meet them kind of where they are and see what happens. Okay, I think I did slam through those like at the speed of light. What size project would be good to consider starting a component library for? I would say it's maybe not necessarily the size of the project as the number of people working on the project. Certainly, if you find yourself in a situation where you are reusing a component over and over and over again, and you feel like you've outgrown your like shared folder, that's a good sign. If there's a lot of like kind of verbal explanation happening around shared components, that's a good sign. Just if things are kind of changing hands a lot, that it's, there's whatever 5 or 10 developers on a team that are all trying to build something that looks like it came from one person's brain. A component library is really great at that, at making it all look like it came from the same person's brain. And thank you guys for the questions. Do you ever reuse your component library across projects? Or you mentioned you'd become a resource for other teams that because they also used your library or made their own. So I guess it depends on how you define projects. I've worked at companies that have kind of multiple repos that wanted it all to have a similar look to kind of feel like it was all one application. They just split it up, and we've definitely used the component library in that way to make sure we have a consistent look. For example, the company that I'm working at now has a primary application. We also have a browser extension. So we've used the component library in both, and it makes them look, like they belong together. Otherwise, I've found that like a component library that I built for one company can't be reused in another because you end up building in styles and components that are so specific to what one project needs that once you kind of get past those basic UI elements, you're kind of like buttons, headers, etc. Things start to get pretty custom, as they should. And so there's not a high level of reusability there. In terms of a resource for other teams, I think especially it's useful between design and development teams for designers to kind of see and click and touch and play with the actual components as they exist, to kind of understand what the user experience is like. I've also seen it used a lot, again, kind of that like prototyping and user testing. I've coordinated with like customer success and customer relations kind of teams to do testing out of the component library. They've used it. And in some places, at the first company, we put actually like marketing guidelines in there. So in addition to like actual components that were being used in applications, we had a section of the component library where we just basically put all the brand guidelines. And that way, everything that was kind of like style related about the application lived in the same place. And the component library was just that place. So that's the situations in which I've seen it used. But I mean, at the end of the day, anything can be a component. So you can upload whatever you want in there. You mentioned testing. How does that work with the library? So in the cases in which I've used the component library to do like usability testing, it's very much not a formal thing. It's more like hallway testing kind of situations. So it's been a case where we've been able to kind of prototype out like a small interaction, like trying to think of a good example, a specific like form possibly, or something, a quick like user interaction piece. And so once we can have that, we can kind of make it its own component, even if it's not going to stay a component, like we just kind of build it out there in the library. And then that gives us a really easy place, and we don't have to worry about like, where is that living and what branch is that on? And like, is that on someone local? And like, whatever, we can just push it up to the component library and it's there. And then, plop it down on somebody's desk or bring in a user and have them sit down in the conference room with us and actually be able to click on it and use it and explore it. And I've found that to be more beneficial than trying to work through like wireframes or other kinds of kind of pixel perfect prototyping. When we can do it in the code, it moves a lot faster. Definitely with the component library, it's more of like a micro-focused thing. And yeah, we do it in Storybook. Storybook is really just like a house, a frame. So yeah, it really just allows you to kind of organize your components. And again, you can put anything into a component as far as Storybook understands it. So yeah. Do you ever work with CSS only-ish frameworks like Bootstrap? Do you find certain frameworks are easier or harder to make component libraries work with in tandem? Perhaps some frameworks are more opinionated or invasive. I have not actually done a lot of work with those kind of CSS frameworks. I am personally a little biased against them, I'll admit, although that might just be the bias of someone who makes their bread and butter writing custom CSS. It's a job security thing. But now, in general, I feel like they often are a little more difficult they're a little over-engineered. You can absolutely use one in a component library. I don't think it would change necessarily anything, just based on I've used other JavaScript frameworks and stuff or other JavaScript libraries, you know, and like it really doesn't much matter, you know. I think though that a lot of the benefits of a component library is being able to create those unique styles and components, and really make something that's custom for the application that you're building. So I feel like maybe the Venn diagram where those things overlap is maybe smaller, but I might just be biased. I can admit that. Tagging off that question, does that include Grid and Flexbox, or do you use those? Yes, I do use those. I love both of those. But I will also throw out there that those are part of vanilla CSS. So you get those just automatically for free. I love Flexbox especially. And yes, but yeah, the way those are pretty standard now, it would be kind of like, you know, do you use border width? Like, yeah. Have we talked, excuse me, have we talked about CSS Less Sass? Do you use those? Yes, is the answer. All of them, not the same one, thankfully. But yeah, actually, the last company that I worked with liked Sass, and we built that right in. This company that I'm with now uses Less. We built that right in. No problems at all. In fact, makes it really, really easy, especially with mix-ins and variables. Just one more of those little kind of Lego pieces that you can leverage in each component that makes your life easier. So yes, absolutely. I eagerly await the day when mix-ins are a part of vanilla CSS the same way variables are. It's got to be coming, right? All right. Thank you guys very much. I'm going to sign off, but as always, you can find me online wherever if there were any questions or anything else you want to talk about. Thank you for coming.